A single letter, yellowed with age and folded into a perfect square, was all that brought Gideon Rodas to the town of Redemption Creek. The paper was so thin you could almost see through it. The ink faded from years of sweat and rain, but the words were burned into his memory. He'd come to this dust-choked town in the middle of nowhere to kill one man. But what he was about to uncover was a secret so dark it would threaten to burn the entire town to the ground, and him along with it. The horse trotted slow, its hooves kicking up clouds of amber dust that hung in the late afternoon air. Gideon's face was a road map of a hard life, carved by sun and wind, but the most prominent feature was the scar. A jagged white line that ran from his left temple straight down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a promise he'd made to himself. He rode past storefronts with peeling paint and windows so grimy they looked like cataracts. The few people on the boardwalk didn't look up. In a town like Redemption Creek, you learned early to mind your own business. He dismounted at the livery, the wood groaning under his boots. A kid, no older than 14, with eyes that had seen too much, took the reins. Gideon didn't like the way the boy looked at him, not with curiosity, but with a flicker of something else. Recognition. It was impossible. No one knew him here. He handed the boy a coin, more than was fair, and watched as the kid's eyes darted from the coin to Gideon's face, then back again, before scurrying away with the horse. Something was wrong. Gideon could feel it in his bones, the same way he could feel a storm coming. "Place to get a drink?" he asked the boy, his voice a low gravel. The kid just pointed a shaky finger toward the end of the street. "The Eagle's Nest," he whispered, then disappeared into the darkness of the stable. The saloon doors swung open with a tired squeak. The place was dim, smelling of stale beer and desperation. A few ranchers nursed their drinks, a barber argued with a blacksmith, and at a table in the back, 4 men played cards. They were dressed too well for this town, their clothes clean, their hands soft. They weren't working men. One of them, a man with silver hair and eyes as cold as a mountain stream, held his cards like he was holding the whole world in his hand. Gideon knew instantly that was him. He walked to the bar, every eye in the place following his every move. He didn't turn his back to the room. He never turned his back to any room. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, a big man with a mustache that drooped with the weight of the town's secrets. The glass slid across the bar. Gideon laid a coin down, his hand hovering near the Colt holstered at his hip. He felt the silver-haired man's eyes on him, studying him, measuring him. This was the man who called himself Jude Crowley, the man who had stolen his family's land, the man who had murdered his sister, the man Gideon had spent the last 6 years hunting. Every instinct screamed at him to draw his pistol and end it right there, to put a bullet right between those cold, calculating eyes. But he didn't. Revenge, he had learned, was a dish best served cold, and his was about to be frozen solid. Just as he raised the glass to his lips, the saloon door swung open again, and the woman who walked in changed everything. She was thin, with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her dress was clean but frayed, and in her hand she clutched a small, golden object. She walked straight to the bar, her eyes fixed on the barkeep, ignoring the stares of the other men. She looked like a ghost, all sharp angles and desperate hope. "Mr. Wendell," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I need to talk to you." The barkeep, Wendell, sighed. "Mrs. Bell, I told you, no more credit." "It's not for credit." She opened her hand. A simple gold wedding band lay on her palm, gleaming under the weak lamplight. "This is real gold. It's worth enough for a week's worth of flour and beans." Wendell picked up the ring, holding it up to the light, a greedy glint in his eye. From the back table, Gideon saw Crowley lean forward, his card game forgotten. He was watching the woman, Clarabelle Bell, with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't pity in his eyes. It was something else, something possessive. "It's thin," Wendell grunted, tossing the ring on the bar. "Half a sack of flour. Take it or leave it." Clarabelle's shoulders slumped. Defeat washed over her face, but she held her ground. "Half a sack? That's robbery." "That's business," Wendell sneered. Gideon had seen enough. He set his whiskey glass down with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent room. "The ring is worth a full sack of flour, A side of salt pork and a pound of beans, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Every head in the saloon snapped toward him. Clarabelle looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Wendell growled. Gideon didn't answer. He simply reached down and drew his Colt revolver, placing it gently on the polished wood of the bar. He didn't point it at anyone. He didn't have to. The gun spoke for itself. "I was a jeweler's apprentice before the war," he lied, the words flowing as easily as water. "That's 18-karat gold. And you're a thief." Wendell's face went pale. His eyes flickered from Gideon's gun to the man at the back table, to Crowley. Gideon watched the silent exchange. Crowley gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. A signal. These men were all connected. Wendell wasn't just a barkeep. He was a pawn. "Fine," Wendell spat, his bravado gone. "A full sack. The fixings. Come by the store in the morning, Mrs. Bell." Clarabelle stared at Gideon, her mouth slightly open. She looked from him to Crowley, and then back again. A silent thank you passed through her eyes, but it was buried under layers of weariness and distrust. As she turned to leave, Crowley's voice, smooth as oiled leather, slithered across the room. "Clarabelle, Thomas Bell's widow, isn't it?" She stopped, her hand on the door. "Yes, Mr. Crowley." "A terrible tragedy. What happened to your husband?" "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "If you're in need of work, I might have something for you. My housekeeper could always use an extra hand with the laundry." The offer was an insult, and they both knew it. It was a power play, a way of reminding her who was in charge. Her jaw tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Crowley, but I manage on my own." She pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. The saloon slowly came back to life, but the atmosphere had changed. Gideon knew he had crossed a line. He had challenged the king in his own court. He finished his whiskey in one swallow, the liquid burning a trail down his throat. He left the coin for the drink, picked up his Colt, and slid it back into its holster. As he walked out, he could feel Crowley's cold eyes on his back, not with anger, but with a chilling, analytical curiosity. The hunter was now being hunted. Gideon caught up with Clarabelle a block down the street. The night air was cool and the stars were beginning to emerge in the deep purple sky. "Mrs. Bell," he called out. She spun around, her hand disappearing into a pocket. He could tell she was ready for a fight. This woman was no damsel in distress. She was a survivor. "I don't need any more of your help," she said, her voice sharp. "Name's Rodas, Gideon Rodas," he said, keeping a safe distance. "I just wanted to make sure you get what you were promised tomorrow." "Men like Wendell have short memories." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Men like Crowley make sure of it. That's the way of the world here, Mr. Rodas." She paused, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. "Why did you do it? Why did you help me?" Before he could answer, a small movement in the shadows behind her caught his eye. Two children, a boy about 10, stood with his shoulders squared, holding a sharpened stick like a spear. A little girl, younger, hid behind her mother's skirt, peeking out at him with wide, frightened eyes. The sight hit Gideon like a physical blow. He saw his sister Sarah in Clarabelle's fierce pride. He saw himself in the boy's defiant stance. He looked past them, at the endless dark prairie. "Let's just say I've seen too many good people go hungry," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He tipped his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Bell." As he walked away, he heard the boy whisper, "Who was that, Ma?" And he heard her reply, hushed and uncertain, "I don't know, Henry. I don't know at all." But Gideon knew. He wasn't just a passing stranger. He was a reckoning, and he had finally come home. He rented a room at the town's only boarding house. It was small, with a lumpy bed and a cracked pitcher for washing. After splashing cold water on his face, he pulled the letter from his breast pocket. He unfolded it under the flickering lamplight, the creases so deep they threatened to split the paper. The handwriting was his sister's, elegant but frantic. "Dearest brother, I pray this finds you alive. Father is gone." His heart gave out. "But that is not why I write. Judah Collins has returned. He has papers, forgeries, claiming father sold him the ranch. He means to force me out, Gideon. The sheriff is his cousin and offers no help. Please, if you can, come home. I fear what he might do. Your loving sister, Sarah. The letter had taken a year to find him, passed from one soldier to the next, across blood-soaked battlefields and makeshift hospitals. By the time it reached him, Sarah was already dead. The official report said she had taken her own life, despondent after losing the family land. But Gideon knew his sister. Sarah would never have given up. She would have fought to her last breath. Judah Collins had murdered her. He folded the letter and placed it back in his pocket, over his heart. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and began to clean his Colt, the motions automatic, ingrained from years of war. For 6 long years he had tracked Collins, following whispers and rumors from Tennessee to Missouri, all the way to this forgotten corner of Montana. And now he knew. Judah Collins was alive and well. He just called himself Jude Crowley now. And he didn't just own a ranch. He owned an entire town. The game had changed. This was no longer about a simple act of revenge. This was about dismantling an empire built on the graves of innocent people. And as Gideon stared out the window into the darkness, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. By helping Clarabelle Bell, he hadn't just made an enemy of Jude Crowley. He had stumbled right into the middle of his next crime. The next morning, Gideon watched from his window as Clarabelle and her 2 children walked to Wendell's general store. The boy Henry walked with a straight back, trying to look older than his years. The little girl June held tight to her mother's hand. They were a tiny, defiant island in a sea of hostility. Gideon saw them come out minutes later, Clarabelle clutching a small sack of flour. Not the full sack she was promised. Not even close. Crowley was sending a message. Gideon spent the day walking the town, listening. In the cafe, he heard whispers of men losing their land to the bank after their crops mysteriously failed. In the barber shop, he heard talk of the new railroad spur Crowley was bringing in, a project that required certain undesirable properties to be cleared. In the livery, the same boy who had taken his horse now refused to meet his eye. The entire town was wrapped in a web of fear, and Jude Crowley was the spider at its center. He saw where the Bell family was living, a makeshift lean-to behind the abandoned schoolhouse, cobbled together from scavenged planks and torn canvas. They weren't the only ones. Other families, pushed off their land by Crowley's schemes, huddled in alleyways and sheds, ghosts in their own town. He went to the sheriff's office. A crudely painted sign read, Sheriff J. Crowley. His cousin, the letter had said. Of course, a man like Collins would never leave the law in someone else's hands. That evening, Gideon bought bread, cheese, and dried beef. He waited until nightfall, then left the bundle near the Bell's shelter. He made sure they didn't see him. This wasn't about thanks. It was an apology to a ghost, a debt he owed his sister. He couldn't save her, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this family. He did this for 3 nights, watching, learning, waiting for his moment. On the 4th day, he was sitting on the boardwalk, whittling a piece of wood into a small horse, when he overheard 2 ranchers talking nearby. Crowley's moving ahead with the evictions, one said, his voice low. Says the railroad can't wait. That Bell widow and her kids have until the end of the week. Then they're out. It's a shame, the other replied, but her plot is prime land for the new depot. Gideon's knife stilled in his hand. The end of the week. He had less time than he thought. He had been planning a quiet final confrontation, but Crowley was forcing his hand. He was going to make Clarabelle and her children homeless, casting them out into the wilderness with nothing, the same way he had cast Sarah out. That night in the Eagle's Nest, he watched Crowley hold court at his card game. The man laughed too loudly, drank too much, a perfect performance of a benevolent town father. But Gideon saw the predator beneath the polished surface. And then he saw it. On Crowley's right hand, a heavy gold signet ring, bearing the initials J.C. Not J.C. for Jude Crowley, J.C. for Judah Collins. It was the same ring the man had worn the day he'd come to the Rodas farm, the forged deed in his hand, a smug smile on his face. The sight sent a jolt of pure, hot rage through Gideon. His hand went to his Colt. 6 years of searching, 6 years of cold nights and empty trails, and here he was. The man who had destroyed his world was sitting less than 20 feet away, laughing. He could end it now. One clean shot. But then he thought of Clarabelle, of Henry and June. If he killed Crowley now, the town would erupt. His cronies, his cousin the sheriff, they would take over. Nothing would change for the people of Redemption Creek. In fact, it might get worse. Killing Collins wasn't enough. He had to kill the idea of him. He had to tear down everything he had built, brick by rotten brick. He needed a plan, and he was running out of time. He saw Crowley making his rounds the next morning, flanked by two of his men. One was a wiry man named Weaver, who always had a rifle. The other a mountain of muscle called Dobbs with a broken nose. Crowley saw Gideon watching him, and to Gideon's surprise, he walked right over. A politician's smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Rhodes, isn't it?" he said, extending a hand. The signet ring gleamed in the morning sun. "Jude Crowley, I understand you've decided to stay in our little town for a spell." Gideon took the offered hand, the urge to crush it almost overwhelming. "Seems like a place with opportunity," he said, his voice level. "Indeed it is." Crowley's smile tightened. His eyes flickered to the scar on Gideon's face. "That's quite a mark you have there. War injury?" "Antietam," Gideon lied again, inventing a battle, a history. He needed to be a stranger, a ghost. "Ah, a Union man," Crowley said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I myself sat out the conflict, a weak constitution." Another lie. Collins had paid another man to fight and die in his place while he got rich selling spoiled meat to both armies. "Are you looking for work, Mr. Rhodes?" Crowley asked, his tone shifting. "A man of your capabilities could do very well in a town like this." It wasn't an offer, it was a test. Was Gideon a threat, or could he be bought? "I have some business of my own to attend to first," Gideon replied. "Of course," Crowley nodded, his eyes cold and calculating. "Well, my door's always open." He tipped his hat and walked away, his two thugs falling into step behind him. Dobbs gave Gideon one last hostile glare before he left. The message was clear. Join me or get out of my way. That night, when Gideon brought the food parcel to the schoolhouse, Clarabelle was waiting for him, her arms crossed, her face set like stone. "We need to talk, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "We need to talk about why a complete stranger is leaving charity on my doorstep every night." Gideon set the bundle down. "Your children are hungry." "And you're a saint?" she shot back. "Nothing in this world is free. I learned that lesson the hard way. So I'll ask you again. What is your price?" The fear was back in her eyes, the fear of a woman who expected the worst from men because she'd rarely been shown anything else. "There's no price, Mrs. Bell." "4 days," she said, her eyes narrowing. "That's a long time to be just passing through. I heard you spoke to Mr. Crowley. I heard about the evictions. This is all connected, isn't it? You and him." He looked at the small shelter, at the faces of the children peeking out from the darkness. He sighed. The time for lies was over. At least some of them. "Yes," he admitted. "It's connected. Crowley and we have some old business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that ends with one man in the ground." The words hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. Her expression shifted from suspicion to something else. Understanding. "Who are you really, Gideon Rhodes?" He reached into his breast pocket, but instead of the letter, his fingers found the small wooden horse he had been whittling. He'd carved it without thinking, a perfect little mare, just like the one Sarah used to have. He held it out to her. Little June crept forward from the shadows and gently took it from his hand, her eyes wide with wonder. "My name is Gideon Rhodes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And Jude Crowley murdered my sister." The confession changed the air between them. The wall of suspicion in Clarabelle's eyes didn't crumble entirely, but a crack appeared. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the pain behind the hard exterior, the grief that fueled him. "His name wasn't always Crowley," Gideon continued. "Back in Tennessee, he was Judah Collins. He used forged papers to steal my family's farm after my father died. My sister Sarah tried to fight him. She sent for me, but the letter didn't reach me in time. By the time I got home, she was dead. They said she hanged herself, but I know he killed her." Clarabelle sank down onto a nearby crate, the fight draining out of her. "My husband," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thomas. They said it was a mining accident. A shaft collapse. But he was the most experienced man in that mine. He knew it better than anyone. You don't think it was an accident? Gideon stated. It wasn't a question. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. The night before he died, he came home with a stack of papers from the mining office. Ledgers. He was so angry. He said Crowley had been lying for years. The gold veins didn't dry up. Crowley was reporting them as empty, buying the claims for pennies on the dollar through the bank, then secretly mining them himself. He was stealing the whole valley blind. What happened to the ledgers? Gideon asked, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the proof he needed. They disappeared, she said, her voice choked with despair. Thomas was going to confront Crowley the next morning, but he never came home. They brought his body up from the mine, and the ledgers were gone. Crowley has them, or he destroyed them. It was the same pattern, the same ruthless, greedy man, destroying lives for profit. Sarah, Thomas Bell, how many others? He's not just a thief, Gideon said, his voice grim. He's a serial killer who uses paper and ink instead of a gun. Suddenly, the town church bell began to ring, not the slow, steady peal for evening prayer, but a frantic, urgent clamor. It was an alarm. Doors opened, and people began spilling into the street, their faces etched with confusion and fear. They all started moving toward the town square. What's happening? Clarabelle asked, pulling her children close. Crowley, Gideon said, his hand instinctively going to his gun. He's making his next move. They followed the crowd. In the center of the square, a makeshift platform had been erected, and standing on it, flanked by Weaver and Dobbs, was Jude Crowley. His face was a mask of solemn concern, but his eyes glittered with triumph. My friends, people of Redemption Creek, he boomed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. I have called you here tonight to deliver some terrible news. Last night, the payroll for our new railroad was stolen. $500 taken from my office. A gasp went through the crowd. Gideon knew it was a lie, a calculated, brilliant lie. But this is not just a simple theft, Crowley continued, his voice rising with dramatic flair. My investigation has revealed a more sinister threat. A dangerous element has taken root in our town. Drifters, squatters, people who take and take, but give nothing back. His eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Clarabelle and her children, standing at the edge of the square. He pointed a finger directly at them. These vagrants are a cancer on our community. They bring crime and filth. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people nodded in agreement, others looked away, ashamed. As your sheriff, as the man who is building a future for this town, I cannot let this stand, Crowley declared. Therefore, I am invoking a town ordinance against vagrancy. Anyone without a permanent residence or gainful employment must leave Redemption Creek within 24 hours. 24 hours, not the end of the week. Now. What about my family, Crowley? Clarabelle shouted, her voice ringing out with surprising strength. You're taking the land our home was on, and now you're throwing us out of town completely? Crowley's expression softened into one of practiced pity. My dear Mrs. Bell, the law applies to everyone. I even offered you respectable work, which you refused. My hands are tied. He then turned back to the crowd. This is for the good of the town, for progress. The railroad is our future, and we cannot let sentimentality stand in its way. As the crowd began to break up, a new energy took hold. Fear was replaced by suspicion. Neighbors began looking at the homeless families with narrowed eyes. Crowley hadn't just issued an eviction notice. He had turned the town against its most vulnerable people. He had given them a scapegoat for the theft he had invented. Gideon saw it all. This wasn't just about clearing land for a railroad depot. It was about consolidating power. It was a purge. And as Crowley stepped down from the platform, his eyes met Gideon's across the square. A slow, smug smile spread across his face. It was a look of pure victory. He hadn't just recognized Gideon as a threat. He had recognized him from Tennessee. He knew exactly who Gideon was. And this whole theatrical display wasn't just for the town. It was a message sent directly to Gideon Rhodes. He knows, Gideon said to Clarabelle as they walked back to the schoolhouse, the jeers and suspicious glares of the townsfolk following them. He knows who I am. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with rage. He's not just going to run us out of town. He'll have his men follow us. Make sure we disappear, just like my Thomas. She was right. This was no longer just an eviction. It was a death sentence. They had 24 hours to find a way to fight back, or they would be erased. Back at their makeshift camp, Henry the boy looked up at Gideon, his young face a mask of anger. My pa wasn't a vagrant, he said, clutching the small wooden horse. He was a good man. I know he was, son, Gideon said, kneeling down to his level. You're going to stop him, aren't you? Henry asked. You're going to stop Mr. Crowley. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Gideon looked from the boy's determined face to Clarabelle's desperate one. His personal quest for revenge had suddenly become so much more. He wasn't just fighting for his sister's memory anymore. He was fighting for a widow and her children. He was fighting for an entire town that was too afraid to fight for itself. Yes, Gideon said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. I am. But as he looked around at the meager camp, with the town's hatred pressing in on them, he had no idea how. Crowley owned the law, he owned the bank, and now he owned the hearts and minds of the people. They had no weapons, no allies, and no proof. And the clock was ticking. Later that night, long after Clarabelle and the children were asleep, Gideon sat by the dying embers of their small fire, his colt resting on his lap. The easy path was to walk into the eagle's nest and put a bullet in Crowley's heart. But that was revenge, not justice. It wouldn't save this family. It wouldn't restore what Crowley had stolen. It would only make him a martyr and Gideon a murderer. There had to be another way, a way to beat Crowley at his own game. He thought about the ledgers Thomas Bell had found, the proof. Crowley must have them. Destroying them would be too risky. A man like Crowley would want to hold on to the proof of his genius, his conquests. He would keep them somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look. The bank, the private safe in the bank. But then a more chilling thought occurred to him. Why the sudden rush? Why shrink the deadline from a week to a single day? The stolen payroll was a lie, a pretext. The real reason had to be something else. The railroad, the depot. It was all connected. What was Crowley so desperate to hide? He looked out across the dark plains, toward the survey stakes marking the path of the new railroad line. They ran right through the land where the Bells and other families were squatting. Prime land for a depot, everyone said. But what if it wasn't for a depot at all? What if the depot was just another lie? He stood up and began walking, following the line of stakes out of town, into the dark, empty hills. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. He walked for nearly an hour, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The stakes led him to a narrow canyon, a place where the land dropped away sharply. And at the bottom of the canyon, he saw it, the entrance to an old abandoned mine shaft, the very mine where Thomas Bell had died. Gideon scrambled down the rocky slope. The entrance was boarded up, with a faded sign that read, "Danger, unsafe." He ripped the boards away. A wave of cold, stale air washed over him. He lit a match, the small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The mine wasn't abandoned. There were fresh tracks in the dust. Shovels and pickaxes leaned against the wall. And deeper inside, he could see the glint of a rich, thick vein of gold. The vein that Crowley had sworn was empty. The vein Thomas Bell had died for. But that wasn't the twist. Deeper still, almost hidden behind a stack of ore carts, was something else. Not gold. Dozens and dozens of wooden crates, stacked high. He pried one open with his knife. It wasn't filled with mining equipment. It was filled with U.S. Army rifles. New ones. Henry repeating rifles, top of the line. And in the crate next to it, boxes and boxes of ammunition. Crowley wasn't just a land thief. He wasn't just a murderer. He was an arms dealer. He was using the ghost mine to store illegal weapons. The railroad wasn't being built to bring commerce to Redemption Creek. It was being built to ship these guns out, to start a private war somewhere, or to sell to the highest bidder. The evictions, the fake theft, The 24-hour deadline, it was all to clear the area before his first big shipment went out. Gideon stared at the crates, the scale of Crowley's evil settling over him like a shroud. He had come here to avenge one murder. Now he was standing in the middle of a conspiracy that could set the whole territory ablaze. He heard a noise from the entrance of the mine, a pebble skittering down the slope. He doused his match and flattened himself against the cold rock wall, his Colt in his hand. Two figures appeared, silhouetted against the night sky. Weaver and Dobbs. Crowley was right, Weaver whispered, his voice echoing in the tunnel. I saw him heading out this way. Let's get this over with, Dobbs grunted. Boss wants him gone. Quietly. They stepped into the mine, their eyes not yet adjusted to the dark. Gideon held his breath. This was it. He could kill them both right here. A clean, silent kill. It would be self-defense. But killing them wouldn't stop Crowley. It would only confirm the man's suspicions and make him more dangerous, more unpredictable. He needed them alive. He needed them to lead him back to the final piece of the puzzle. As they moved deeper into the mine, passing his hiding spot, Gideon slipped out behind them. He climbed back up the canyon wall, his mind racing faster than it ever had on any battlefield. He now had the what, the where, and the why. He knew Crowley's secret, but knowing it and proving it to a town full of terrified sheep were two different things. He needed help. He ran back toward the town, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. He didn't go to the schoolhouse. He couldn't risk leading them to Clarabelle. Instead, he went to the one place in town that Crowley didn't own, the one place that still stood for something other than greed and fear. He ran to the church. The old wooden door creaked open under his hand. Reverend Thomas was asleep in a small room in the back. Gideon shook him awake gently. Mr. Rhodasis? What is it? The old man asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Crowley isn't just stealing land, Reverend, Gideon said, his voice low and urgent. He's running guns, army rifles, enough to start a war. He's storing them in the old abandoned mine, the same one where Thomas Bell died. The Reverend's face went ashen in the moonlight filtering through the window. Lord have mercy. He's planning to ship them out on his new railroad. That's why he needs the families gone. He can't have witnesses. He gave them 24 hours. By tomorrow night, Clarabelle and her children will either be gone or they'll be dead. What can we do? The Reverend asked, his voice trembling. He controls the sheriff, the whole town. You told me a federal marshal passes through here, Gideon said. Marshal Wilson. Yes, but he's not due for another 2 days. It will be too late. Gideon's eyes scanned the small, simple room. His gaze fell on the church's steeple, a dark finger pointing toward the sky. Then we have to bring the law to us, he said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. The railroad telegraph line runs about 5 miles north of here. If someone could get a message out to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Benton. No one could make it, the Reverend said, shaking his head. Crowley's men are watching everyone. They'd be seen leaving town. Not everyone, Gideon said. He looked the old man in the eye. Reverend, how much do you believe in the power of a miracle? The first light of dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Time was running out. Weaver and Dobbs would have reported back to Crowley by now, telling him Gideon had vanished. The hunt would be on. Gideon explained his plan to the Reverend, a wild, improbable scheme that relied on faith, courage, and pure, unadulterated bluff. The old man listened, his expression shifting from doubt to a flicker of hope. It's dangerous, son, he said when Gideon finished. It's our only chance, Gideon replied. Can you get a message to Clarabelle? Tell her to be ready. Tell her to trust me. The Reverend nodded. I will. As Gideon slipped out the back of the church, he saw them. 2 of Crowley's men, trying to be inconspicuous, watching the boarding house. They were looking for him. He doubled back, using the alleys and shadows he now knew so well, and made his way to the livery stable. The stable boy was there, sweeping hay. When he saw Gideon, his eyes went wide with fear. He opened his mouth to shout. Don't, Gideon said, his voice calm but cold as ice. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. I know you work for him. I saw you watching me the day I arrived. You report to him, don't you? The boy trembled, unable to speak. He just nodded, tears welling in his eyes. It's all right, Gideon said, softening his tone. I'm not going to hurt you, but I need you to take a message back to your boss. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single shiny bullet from his Colt. He pressed it into the boy's hand. You give this to Mr. Crowley. You tell him Gideon Rhodes knows about the guns. You tell him I have the ledgers, Thomas Bell's ledgers. It was a lie, a massive, dangerous lie, but it was the only card he had left to play. And you tell him, Gideon continued, looking the boy dead in the eye, that I want to make a deal. Me, the ledgers, and the woman and her children, in exchange for safe passage out of this territory. Tell him to meet me at noon in the town square, and tell him to come alone. The boy stared at the bullet in his palm as if it were a venomous snake. Then he turned and ran, faster than Gideon had ever seen him run. Gideon had just declared war. He had bluffed, claiming to have the one piece of evidence that could hang Crowley. Now he had to pray the man was arrogant enough and greedy enough to believe him. He had just a few hours to prepare the town square for a showdown that would determine the fate of everyone in Redemption Creek. He had no army, no allies he could count on, and a single gun with 5 bullets left. And he was walking into a trap. He knew it, but it was a trap he was setting himself. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The minutes ticked by like hours. Gideon moved through the town like a ghost. He went to the blacksmith shop first. The blacksmith was a big man, his face permanently stained with soot, his arms thick with muscle. He was also a man who had lost his brother in the same mining accident that killed Thomas Bell. Crowley's a snake, the blacksmith growled when Gideon told him part of the story, leaving out the guns for now. But he's got the whole town coiled up tight. I need a distraction, Gideon said. Something loud. Something that will draw every one of Crowley's men to one place, away from the square. At noon exactly. The blacksmith looked at Gideon, then at the calluses on his own hands. He thought of his brother. A slow nod was his only answer. Next, Gideon went to the cafe. Widow Jennings, a woman whose tired eyes held a fire that hadn't quite been extinguished, ran the place. Her husband had been the town's original sheriff, before he'd conveniently fallen from his horse and broken his neck, allowing Crowley's cousin to take his place. I need every able-bodied woman you can find, Gideon told her. The ones who've lost their husbands, their land, the ones who are tired of being afraid. I need them in the square before noon. To do what? She asked, her arms crossed. Become widows twice over. To bear witness, Gideon said. Crowley is a bully, and like all bullies, he's a coward at heart. He performs for an audience. Today we're going to give him one he can't control. The final piece of the plan was the most dangerous. He found Clarabelle and the Reverend at the schoolhouse, getting the children ready. It's time, Gideon said. He handed Clarabelle his knife. This is for you. She looked at the blade, then at him. What if your plan doesn't work? Then you get your children out of here. Run and don't look back. He looked at Henry, who was staring at him with a child's unwavering faith. Henry, I need you to be the man of the family for a little while longer. You protect your sister, you hear me? The boy nodded, his chin held high. Yes, sir. The church bell began to toll, not the frantic alarm of the night before, but a slow, solemn chime. 11:30. Gideon walked into the town square. It was empty. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. He positioned himself in the center, by the well, his back to nothing, his eyes on everything. He could feel them watching from the windows, from the rooftops. Crowley's men. He was surrounded. This was a suicide mission. Then he saw her, Widow Jennings, walking out of her cafe, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked to the edge of the square and stood there, her arms crossed. Then another woman came out of the general store. Then 2 more from the dressmaker's shop. Soon there were a dozen of them. The widows of Redemption Creek. They formed a silent circle around the square, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the sheriff's office. They were his army. At 5 minutes to noon, Jude Crowley stepped out of his office. He wasn't alone. His cousin, the sheriff, was with him, as were Weaver and Dobbs. So much for coming alone. Rhodes! Crowley called out, his voice booming with false confidence. But Gideon could see the unease in his eyes as he took in the circle of silent women. I hear you have something that belongs to me. I have the truth, Gideon called back. The ledgers that prove you murdered Thomas Bell and a dozen other men for their claims. Crowley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Bold words from a dead man. You have nothing. Then why are you here? Gideon countered. Why not just have your men shoot me where I stand? Just then, a massive explosion rocked the town. A plume of black smoke rose from the far end of the street. The blacksmith had done his job. He'd blown his own forge. Weaver and Dobbs, startled, looked toward the smoke. Go! Crowley barked at them. See what that was? As his two main enforcers ran off, Crowley's eyes narrowed at Gideon. A clever trick, but you're still alone. Am I? Gideon said, gesturing to the women. These people know what you are, Crowley. They know what you did to their husbands, their sons. They know nothing, he sneered. Then let's show them, Gideon said. Your secret is buried in the old mine, isn't it? Along with Thomas Bell. But you didn't just bury a man, did you? You buried crates full of army rifles. The color drained from Crowley's face. The sheriff took a nervous step back. This finally was the one truth he couldn't deny. He had no idea how Gideon could possibly know. You're insane, Crowley stammered. Am I? Gideon shouted, his voice now directed at the windows and doors where the rest of the town was hiding. Or is it insane to believe that one man can own a town? That he can murder his neighbors and steal their land? That he can build a railroad not for progress, but to ship illegal guns? From the corner of his eye, Gideon saw movement. It was the Reverend leading Clarabelle and her children into the square. They stood with the other widows. Tell them, Clarabelle, Gideon yelled. Tell them what your husband found. Clarabelle stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. My husband Thomas discovered that Jude Crowley was a fraud. He found the ledgers proving he was stealing gold from the mines. He was going to expose him, and for that, Mr. Crowley had him killed. Lie! Crowley screamed, his composure finally shattering. He drew his pistol. All of you! You're all dead! He pointed the gun not at Gideon, but at Clarabelle. But before he could fire, another voice rang out. A new voice. Drop the weapon, Crowley! Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the square, covered in dust from a hard ride, were three men. One of them wore the unmistakable badge of a U.S. Marshal. Marshal Wilson. Crowley froze, his face a mask of disbelief. Marshal, you're not due for 2 more days. Got an urgent message on the telegraph, the marshal said, his rifle leveled at Crowley's chest. Something about an illegal arms shipment and a town held hostage. Seems the Reverend's prayers travel faster than a horse. Crowley looked from the marshal to Gideon, his mind reeling, trying to understand how it was possible. He didn't know about the secret wire the Reverend had helped the telegraph operator string up to the church steeple years ago, a hidden line for emergencies, powered by a bank of batteries. A miracle line, the Reverend had called it. Seeing he was trapped, Crowley's eyes filled with a desperate, wild rage. He swung his pistol back toward Gideon. If I'm going down, you're coming with me, Rhodes, he fired, but he was too slow. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Crowley's gun or the marshal's rifle. It was from Gideon's Colt. Crowley staggered back, a look of shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. He dropped his pistol and collapsed into the dust. The sheriff, his cousin, threw his hands in the air. I had no part in this. I was just following orders. The reign of Jude Crowley was over. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek began to breathe again. The marshal's investigation, guided by Gideon and Clarabelle, uncovered everything. They found the guns in the mine. They found the real ledgers hidden in a secret compartment in Crowley's office. They found deeds with forged signatures, and the town doctor confessed to signing falsified death certificates for years, all under threat from Crowley. The truth, once unleashed, washed over the town like a cleansing flood. The stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners. Clarabelle and her children moved back into their small house, the land now legally hers. The town council, freed from Crowley's grip, voted to rename the town. It was no longer Redemption Creek. They called it Bellwether, in honor of the man who had died trying to save it. Gideon stayed long enough to see the changes take root. He watched as Henry and June played in their own yard, their laughter echoing in the clean mountain air. He saw the fear leave the eyes of the townspeople, replaced by a sense of hope he hadn't seen since before the war. One evening, as he was preparing to leave, Clarabelle found him at the livery, saddling his horse. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "My work here is done," he replied, not meeting her eye. "Gideon," she said, her voice soft, "Sarah would be proud of you. This wasn't just vengeance. It was justice. For all of them." He finally looked at her. He saw gratitude in her eyes, but also something more. A future. A life. A peace he hadn't allowed himself to even consider for 6 long years. For the first time, the jagged scar on his face didn't feel like a brand of hatred, but a reminder of survival. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked past her, toward the setting sun, painting the hills in hues of amber and gold. The letter from his sister was still in his pocket, but it felt different now. Lighter. Not a burden, but a memory. "I'm not sure," he said, and for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty felt like freedom. "Maybe I'll just ride for a while." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her. She didn't say goodbye. She just smiled, a real smile. As Gideon Rhodes rode out of the town of Bellwether, he wasn't running from a ghost anymore. He was riding toward a sunrise. He had come to Redemption Creek seeking an ending, but what he found was a new beginning. The story of Gideon Rhodes and the fall of Jude Crowley became a legend in that part of the country. A reminder that even in the darkest of places, one person armed with the truth can make a difference. It shows that true justice isn't about an eye for an eye. It's about building a better world on the ashes of the old one. What do you think? Was Gideon right to risk everything on a bluff? Or should he have taken the path of simple revenge from the start? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want more tales of justice, secrets, and the wild frontier, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.